Good evening once again. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. The Bible and its tradition team is honored to pursue our Lenten reflection on love's journey to the cross with you. El equipo de la Biblia y su tradición se complace en continuar nuestra reflexión cuaresmal sobre la jornada del amor hacia la cruz. La semana pasada exploramos el ministerio de Jesús desde el punto de vista de su desplazamiento constante por los pueblos de Palestina y a Jerusalén. Last week, we sketched Jesus' ministry as that of a wandering prophet, reaching out to the people where they lived and worked. Vimos el contraste entre Juan Bautista, arraigado en el desierto de Judea, vimos el contraste entre Juan Bautista arraigado en el desierto de Judea y Jesús viajando por los pueblos de Galilea. We paid close attention to the courage Jesus summoned to face opposition in Jerusalem and how a true disciple in the Gospels is called to follow on his master's wake to the end. Prestamos atención al llamado a seguir a Jesús por el camino que lo lleva a Jerusalén, a la confrontación con las autoridades y al martirio. But we also reflected on the reason Jesus, walking along with his disheartened disciples and inspiring them to continue the journey after his departure. Jesús no abandona a sus discípulos, sino que camina misteriosamente con ellos aún después de su pasión y su resurrección. Ello indica cuán importante es el caminar en la vida de la Iglesia. Hoy veremos con mayor profundidad el significado de la cruz en el caminar de Jesús, desde el Evangelio y la primera carta de San Juan. Today we read the event of the cross in light of St. John's Gospel and his first letter. Aside from St. Paul, St. John is the New Testament writer who explicitly develops this idea of Jesus' ministry as that of a son doing his Father's will while on a mission that involves travel. I recall that when I was a kid, my father would send me with money to the bakery to get warm bread for late breakfast on the weekend. I was entrusted with a bag made of cloth, the approximate sum of money I needed for the purchase, and a verbal account of the sorts of bread that were preferable, as well as how many were required. I had discretionary power at the bakery, depending on what might be available or not. But it was crisp clear that I was not to return with pastry I would love, only bread. This anecdote illustrates the human experience we use to talk about Jesus' relationship to God and the value of what he accomplished on earth. When we say God sent his Son to save the world, we mean Jesus did for us what God intended but couldn't accomplish in person, so to speak. Jesus came to us as a son sent by God the Father with an errand. Only the errand was not to purchase bread for the Father to eat, rather to offer himself as bread for all of God's children to be nourished. St. John uses bread, water, and light as symbolical goods that Jesus brings to us to share in God's life-giving power. But Jesus says in St. John's Gospel that He is the light. He is the spring of fresh water, and He is the bread that has come down from heaven. So what Jesus has to offer is Himself. That amounts to nothing less than self-sacrifice. Jesus is offering us Himself as bread, as light, as water. Hence, the cross is the hour of Jesus completing His mission by giving us even His very life, flesh, blood, and spirit as a God-sent gift. Thus, the sacrifice at the cross becomes the ultimate expression of Christ's and God's love for us. Cristo nos ofrece su vida en cuerpo, sangre y espíritu para que vivamos de la misma vida de Dios, la vida divina. El Hijo obedece al Padre y viene hasta nosotros para darnos su luz, su paz y su amor. Cristo nos enseña, pues, cuánto nos aman Él y el Padre al ofrecer su vida por nosotros, al alejarse del Padre para estar con nosotros y vivir con nosotros y morir por nosotros. Ahora bien, Jesús se acerca, pero nos llama también para que nos acerquemos nosotros mismos. Vengan y verán, nos dice en Juan capítulo 1, versículo 39. Si queremos tener noticias del Padre, si queremos oír su voz y aprender de Él, en Juan 6:45, nos toca hacer lo que podemos, es decir, acercarnos a Cristo, luz de Dios venida al mundo. Al caminar de Jesús hasta nosotros, en su encarnación, corresponde nuestro caminar hacia Él en nuestras vidas. The Son's journey towards us through the Incarnation calls for our meeting up with Him in our lives. Come and see, says Jesus to each one of us in St. John's Gospel. Taste and see, do we sing in our liturgical gatherings. If St. John portrays the Incarnation as a daring journey from God's bosom all the way to us in our earthly predicament, he then also suggests that Jesus' crucifixion is the means by which Jesus ascends back to heaven and returns to the Father. The cross is portrayed by St. John as a new Jacob's ladder, as Jacob's dream in Genesis 28:12 alluded to in John 1:51. A ladder extending from earth all the way to heaven. Through the lifting up of Jesus on the cross, the Son of Man is at the very same time being lifted up to heaven, and the Son is returning to His Father once His mission is accomplished. Remember the very last words of Jesus in John chapter 19, verse 30, at the cross. It is finished. It is accomplished. So, when we contemplate the cross with faith, says St. John, we see not a criminal being executed by the Roman Empire. Rather, we see the return of the Son to the Father's side after faithfully completing his mission. Según San Juan, la crucifixión no es un momento trágico o deshonroso para Jesús. Aunque sea un momento extremadamente doloroso y difícil, Es la hora en que cumple totalmente con su misión y la manera misma como Él regresa al Padre. La cruz se vuelve una nueva escalera de Jacob, como en Génesis 28, capítulo 28, versículo 12, aludida en Juan, capítulo 1, versículo 51. Una escalera que cubre la distancia entre el cielo y la tierra para que el Hijo pueda subir de regreso al Padre. Ahora bien, esa visión de la fe implica también un llamado a corresponder nosotras. Así como al venir el Hijo de Dios nos llama a acercarnos a Él, así también cuando el Hijo se va, nos llama a seguirle después y nos indica el camino. Hermanas, hermanos, esto es lo más difícil por escuchar que tenga yo que decir esta noche. Cuando Jesús nos dice en Juan capítulo 12, versículo 26, que quien quiera servirle, deberá seguirle. Y cuando Jesús nos dice a nosotros, sus discípulos, que ya sabemos el camino de regreso, nos está indicando la cruz como vía de comunión con Él. Ese es el camino. Brothers and sisters, do we realize what this departure of the Son by His lifting up on the cross actually implies for all of us who would like to follow Jesus? If, as St. John says in chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, how could we avoid for ourselves the path of Jesus, the path that leads to the cross? The cross of Christ is the path of the Christian on one's journey to God. But there is yet more to it. I would like to pursue this reflection by looking closely at one very challenging and interesting verse of the first letter of St. John. It reads, quote, "This is the one who came through water and blood, Jesus Christ, not by water alone, but by water and blood." That is taken from the first letter of John, chapter 5, verse 6. The first letter has been considered from old to be arguing against Christians who denied the full importance and extent of the Incarnation. Here, the verse is stressing the importance of blood over water for the coming of Jesus Christ. The Church Fathers relate these two symbols to the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist, water and blood. Yet, we also know the Eucharist evokes Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, the offering of His flesh and blood. Water is associated as a symbol for God's Word and Spirit, as if when we were thirsty for God's Word, is as if we were thirsty for God's water. And as we see in Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, He promises to give her a water that would quench her thirst. So, if we add up these elements, we could interpret this verse to mean Jesus came through water and blood, to mean Jesus ministered not only by teaching through His Word, but also through His actions, here powerfully and cogently summarized as His giving up of His life and blood on the cross for us. So, Jesus was not merely a prophet or sage who taught. His self-sacrifice did make a difference. God's life reached us not only by word, but also by deed. Now look at the, or here at the wording. The wording is in Spanish up there. So, Jesus came through water and blood. This may imply, I suggest, that the Incarnation was not fully accomplished until Jesus spent his very last drop of blood for our sake. Jesus came through water and blood. He came fully to our humanity and world the moment he had no further life to forego. He was fully incarnate the moment he shared our fate to the death. And through this bold and generous gesture, he taught us better than with any parable or discourse the breadth and intensity of God's love for us. Again, St. John is relentless. We may only show we know God's love by giving up our lives for our brothers and sisters, like Jesus did. I have been attempting to show that in the slides by showing the confession on Jesus in the left column, and also to the right what is expected of the disciples. And there is always a correspondence. Jesus came, and then disciples are called to come to Jesus. And then Jesus leaves through his sacrifice on the cross, and on the right side column, the disciples are called to follow and serve the Master where he is, that is, to follow him up on the cross. El hecho que Jesús vino mediante agua y sangre, según San Juan, nos muestra que a veces tenemos una visión un poco estrecha de lo que es el misterio de la Encarnación. No se trata de un evento previo al nacimiento de Jesús, sino de esposar nuestra vida humana hasta el extremo de morir como nosotros y de morir por nosotros. Dios llega hasta nosotros plenamente cuando Jesús expira en la cruz. No puede haber mejor revelación del amor de Dios. Y así también no puede haber mejor demostración de nuestro ser y de nuestro entender cristiano que el de ofrecer nuestras vidas por nuestras hermanas y nuestros hermanos. Muchas gracias.